Well, welcome for the 10th stage of this first series of European journeys in which we follow the footsteps of the Apostle Paul in Italy. And in fact, this is the final stage of this series. And even though the title of this series is The Footsteps of the Apostle Paul in Italy, we are in fact visiting today a basilica which is technically not part of Italy. Well, how come? And in fact, the basilica I'm talking about is not even St. Peter's, as many of you would think, but it is the Basilica San Paolo fuori le Mura, or in English, St. Paul outside the walls. This basilica is located a bit more than 2 kilometers north from the abbey we visited last week. And so, how come this basilica is not in Italy? Well, in fact, it is an extraterritorial property of the Holy See, or in other words, it is an exclave of the world's smallest state, known as the Vatican. Well, finding a basilica here is all but surprising. And yet, the Basilica San Paolo fuori le Mura stands as one of the best testimonies of the triumph of Christianity over Roman paganism in the 4th century. And one of the main reasons for this is that the basilica began to be built in the 330s. And this was a crucial time for Rome and for Europe as a whole, because it was indeed just a few years after the famous Edict of Milan in 313, when Christianity began to be tolerated in the Roman Empire. But what makes this basilica even more important is the location itself, for it was built on the site of an ancient huge underground necropolis by the Via Ostiense, which was an ancient Roman road of 30 kilometers or so, which connected Rome to the harbor of Ostia. And under the altar today, we find a marble slab with the following writings: Paolo Apostolo Mart, and then the word doesn't finish, but we understand that it means Paul Apostle Martyr. And it was in fact here that the corpse of Paul was buried after his execution in the 60s, as we saw last week. As we were visiting the site of Paul's execution in our last stage, we realized that the main reason for the supreme penalty could have been his ministry, which had triggered what we called the First Great Roman Awakening. But now that Paul was dead, how did Christianity survive the apostle? Did the movement die out with the death of the apostle? Or did it spread so much that it transformed the entire empire? In other words, has Christianity positively shaped the West, or did it have no significant impact? Well, the question of what was the source of progress in the West continues to be explored in our day. And since the 18th century, it is commonplace to hear that the main source of progress in our societies is the Enlightenment. Such views claim that the Christianization of the Roman Empire had given birth to the so-called Dark Ages of medieval Europe, until finally some 18th century philosophers rediscovered the great legacies of Greek and Roman civilizations that Christianity had crushed. Well, this view of history, even though it is widespread in the West, cannot be further from the truth. And the best way to understand how Christianity transformed Europe is to look at how pre-Christian societies were structured. In recent years, several works have been done to reveal the stark contrast between pre-Christian societies and ours today, only to realize that the only factor of progress in the West is in fact the gospel. One such work is the book Inventing the Individual, The Origins of Western Liberalism, written by the Oxford scholar Larry Siedentop. In the first chapter, Siedentop describes that in remote times society was structured around the family, which itself was held together around the worship of ancestors, who were believed to be controlling spirits over the family. And so the patriarch of the family was the priest who made sacrifices to the deceased ancestors. And this setting created obvious inequalities. Siedentop writes, and I quote, "It was in many ways a repugnant society. It was a society in which the worship of the ancestors, the family as a cult and primogeniture, created radically unequal social identities, not just between man and woman, but also between the firstborn son and other male offspring, end quote. Siedentop continues to explain that as families began to gather together and form city-states, their uniting factor remained religion. But to avoid that the gods of a family would rule over all the others, new gods arose, often taken from nature, that were believed to protect the city. And so the primary role of the city's rulers was to be priests, serving the gods, and kings, enforcing religious laws in society. And with time, such religious society developed an aristocratic class, while the rest of society was identified as plebeian. Well, so neither the ancient family, nor the ancient city-state, nor the pagan empires could provide values such as human dignity, the human rights, or democracy, which are behind the progress that the West has experienced, as the philosophers of the Enlightenment claimed it to be. So if antiquity did not provide the basis for the values that have shaped the West, where do these come from? And this is where, according to Siedentop, the Apostle Paul came into the picture. He says that, and I quote, "The earliest surviving writings about Jesus are the work of Saul of Tarsus," end quote, who is, of course, Paul. While ancient societies were structured around gods that inevitably generated inequalities, Paul announced that the only true God, Yahweh, the one who is, had sent his only Son to reconcile humans who had, since the fall of Adam and Eve, lived in constant rebellion to him. God's only Son, Jesus Christ, reconciled the world to God the Father through his sacrifice at the cross for the sins of humanity. Now, anyone who believed in Jesus Christ had gained the right to be called a child of God. So according to Siedentop, Paul's writings opened the way to a new understanding of human identity. It was because we rediscovered to be created in the image of the true God that we had now a basis to embrace human dignity, to defend human rights, or to advocate democracy. No other religion, not even modern secularism, which is a direct descendant of the Enlightenment, can uphold such values, which are the pillars of the freedoms upon which the Western world was built. So, while the necropolis reminds us that Paul was ready to pay with his blood for his faith in the God he proclaimed here in Rome, the Basilica San Paolo fuori Mura is yet another testimony of the triumph of light over darkness. For even though the Roman authorities succeeded in killing Paul's body, they could not stop the spread of the message of hope that is at the heart of all the progress the Western world has ever known. So this is the end of the first series of European Journeys. See you next week for the first stage of a new series of European Journeys.